Hello everyone, welcome to the Apocalyst review of The Call of the Wild. This movie was first released in February of 2020 and was directed by Chris Sanders. He also helped direct Lilo and Stitch and How to Train Your Dragon. It's in the drama-action genre and delivers on both fronts. I will also add that it's in the book adaptation subgenre. You get a tale of loyalty, love, sacrifice, and finding one's way, with a fine mix of adventure that spans a surprisingly wide variety of beautiful scenes, all giving a glimpse into the wonderful historical settings of the time period. When I was a kid, I read The Call of the Wild and other books with similar themes, such as White Fang. Actually, I read a lot when I was growing up and wish I had more time for it now because after seeing the movie, I want to reread the book. Anyways, it's been a while since I've read it, but from what I recall, this seems to be a competent transition to the big screen. Right now, CGI and special effects are so good that it's a great time to make a movie about a dog with a personality like this, with specific actions and personality quirks that a real dog could perhaps never act out in such a precise manner and execute it well. So it all looked believably good for the most part. There were a few times that things seemed a little awkward with the dog, but for the most part, it looked well done. In addition to getting into books like these about the great outdoors I previously mentioned, I loved being outside and exploring when I was growing up. This also helps to give tales like this a special place in my heart and a special connection to the story. I was lucky that grandparents and great-grandparents on both my mom and dad's side of the family owned relatively large parcels of land equipped with forests, ponds, creeks, and plenty to explore. These were plots of land that had been clearly lived in while also being completely overrun by nature. What I mean by this is that on my mom's side of the family, on my grandma and grandpa's property, for example, old train tracks that had long since been out of service ran right through their property. You could find old railroad nails, which are giant if you've never seen one, discarded train parts, pottery, and random knickknacks that were seemingly discarded by passengers of old. When you were lucky, you could even stumble across old Native American arrowheads from time to time, which were really cool. Especially for me, since I'm actually a member of the Chickasaw Nation. It felt like finding a small connection to my ancestors on that side of the family. My grandpa was also a huge collector of everything, and you may find anything from old cars to old pop machines stashed away in a shed or even sitting in an open field. Believe it or not, he actually had an old passenger car from a train sitting out there too. It was and still is awesome. In short, the place had history, and it was great fun never knowing what you might stumble across and imagine what it must have been like to see the train coming through, or imagine what it must have been like to be a passenger riding through. My grandma said she remembers when the train was still in operation, running through there and taking it to visit her parents' farmhouse further away in the countryside. On my dad's side, my great-grandparents had an old farmhouse. There was a barn with hay bales in the hayloft, or mow, ready for the winter that were never used, stalls for horses and cattle, a pig pen, a chicken coop, farm equipment, and other random things strewn all over the property just waiting to be explored. One other thing out there that I'd like to mention was old garbage piles. Yeah, apparently on a lot of these old farms, there was a time when trash was just dumped in random places and then just left there. From what I can tell, it wasn't even burned, and even if it was put in a shallow spot, no attempt seems to have been made to bury it. So if you dug into them, you had to be very careful because you never knew if snakes were hiding out in there or if you would run into pack rats. I'm telling you, some of the pack rats I saw appeared to be close to the size of rabbits. That is no joke. These things were huge, and you didn't want to corner one and force it to fight. If I hadn't seen them with my own eyes, I would never have believed there were wild rodents of that size running around on Kansas farms. Despite the dangers, digging into these old trash piles could reward you with truly neat things you would these days only see in a museum. So oftentimes I felt like it was worth it. As the old saying goes, one person's trash is another person's treasure. In many ways, these old dump heaps were time capsules, and as you know, I love history. Between the two places I just described, what a great time and place to grow up. Stories like The Call of the Wild are extra personal to me because of this. In short, this movie is what I would call pleasant. It's also nostalgic for me in terms of both reminding me of reading this and spending time at my grandparents' and great-grandparents' homes and the adventures I had exploring their land. We didn't have wolves, but it was easy to imagine coyotes, which we did have, as such, and stepping into the woods felt in a way like stepping into one of these stories and for a time having a grand real-life adventure of your own. One thing I want to point out is that this movie doesn't just take place in the woods. You get a decently wide variety of scenes and situations from the time period, which I will discuss in more detail shortly. So this is where I'm going to get into spoilers. So spoiler alert, you've been warned. The story starts off telling the tale of a dog in a quaint little town in the south, roaming about unchecked, unchallenged, taking and chomping down whatever he can sink his canine fangs into, whether that be food you were about to eat or a newspaper he just felt like running off with. A dog named Buck, who is a bad beauty, that is borderline out of control. Everyone is too scared to do anything because he's the mayor's dog, and they are afraid of incurring his wrath. Must be one brutal ace mayor if just the sight of his dog keeps him all in line. So the dog gets away with nearly everything with almost zero consequence at best. He catches the attention of some wicked men, as the Lord of the Rings Smeagol would say, who notice that because of his size and stature, he would make an excellent sled dog in the north. Then this wild ace canine goes on one wild ace adventure. It starts when he destroys a fantastic southern feast laid out by the mayor for his guests and is put outside for the night to think about what he's done as punishment. I'm not sure why the mayor talks to his dog like he can understand him, but he does. It is at this time that the wicked men think that this is their chance and decide to pounce. They trick him into a trap and cart his giant dog ace clear up to Alaska. It's worth it to them because this is the Gold Rush era, and they know that they will be able to fetch a good price for a dog like this, and that their hard work and trouble will all be worth it. Buck, for the first time in his life, is disciplined and even abused by a human where he realizes he's not in Kansas or the Deep South anymore, and that his days of living the easy life and getting his way are over. The thieves have a club that they use to beat Buck into submission with. This is when he meets a warm and friendly yet demanding postman and his wife. The postman delivers mail all across the frosty north and decides that Buck is exactly the dog he needs to round out his team. Mostly for his rather large size. Mostly. You can see the look of anger, resentment, and burning hate on the lead dog's face every time he looks at Buck. Buck looks after the other dogs on the team, oftentimes sharing his meals, helping him get water by breaking ice with his paws, leveraging his large size, while the current lead dog's growing resentment and burning rage is nearly palpable. Eventually, the lead dog can't take it anymore and decides to fight Buck, where it appears he wants to not only put him in his place, but leave him for dead, which he attempts to do. Buck seems to be lying on the ground defeated when his inner wolf is suddenly awakened. The other dogs on the team come to Buck's aid, and finally utilizing his rather large size and awesome strength, he rather easily defeats the lead dog, who then, feeling like he no longer has a purpose, wanders off into the frosty night, never to be seen again. Buck, on the other hand, then becomes the new lead dog, where he really feels like he has a purpose for the first time in his life. Under his guidance, the sled team is on time for their deliveries from this point on. Sadly, it's not to be, for long at least, as the government decides they won't be using sled teams to deliver mail anymore, and his team is being disbanded. Buck is then sold to a man who heard the call of the gold rush and has come to Alaska hoping to find his fortunes in the frosty north. We will call him the Arrogant Man, and he knows nothing of the ways of decency or how to survive outside the bounds of civilization. His sled is overweight and frozen to the ground, but he blames the dogs and is about to physically beat them. It's at this point Harrison Ford's character, named John Thornton, steps in, stops him, and makes a fool out of him in front of the whole town. Later, the same man gets stuck trying to cross a river, and our hero dog Buck collapses. The Arrogant Man, with no knowledge of the great outdoors, is about to shoot Buck in cold blood and arrogant anger when John Thornton, who almost too conveniently happens to be nearby in the woods, steps in and stops him yet again. John cuts Buck loose and the rest of the team goes on. The Arrogant Man later comes stumbling back into town and finds John Thornton in a local saloon. There he tells everyone how he lost his whole team of dogs, blames John for all his misfortunes, and attacks him like a wild-eyed psycho. Buck then jumps in to save John, and the townspeople throw the arrogant idiot out of the salon and tell him not to come back. The Arrogant Man promises revenge the next time they meet, essentially saying it'll be John Thornton's ace. So is this foreshadowing or an empty threat? Let's find out. At this point, John Thornton lets Buck come home with him. Buck really begins to hear the call of the wild at this point, begins staying out later and later every night, and slowly joins a pack of wolves timber wolves that is, after rescuing one of them from drowning. A beautiful white wolf even becomes Buck's companion. John Thornton is struggling with how to come to terms with his own life and losses, such as a child that passed away and the wife and home he left behind after buckling under the pressure of the mental anguish and not being able to come to terms with the loss. He realizes that Buck has found his home here in the wilds of Alaska, where he stays out all night hunting with freaking timber wolves and is increasingly the leader of the pack. Buck has answered the call of the wild, and now it's time for he himself, John that is, to go home. He dumps the excess gold he's found, saying that there is only so much a man needs. He'll keep a pocket full of gold, however, which he says are groceries for life. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Not craving fame, fortune, or material possessions, he seems to find peace in the simple thought of finding his wife and knowing he won't starve. John Thornton makes preparations to set out the following morning and tells Buck that if you find your home, you should never leave it, and that he doesn't want Buck coming back with him. Otherwise, Buck would be making the same mistake that John did. Buck belongs here in the wild, and they both knew it. That night, though, the arrogant man, who can't seem to shake his desire to make John pay for his own failures, finds John in his cabin while Buck is out hunting, sets his cabin on fire, and shoots him in the gut, all while screaming wildly about how John made his misfortunes befall him so he could keep all the gold for himself. John, now lying on the ground dying, realizes what's most important in the end, and that it's not gold. He takes his last remaining gold out of his pocket and throws it at the arrogant man, or the arrogant scumbag, I should say, saying, "Take it all of it. It won't bring anyone back from the dead." And I think that was being made in dual reference. One for the child he lost that is long gone, and for the fact that it won't save him from his mortal wound to the gut inflicted by the wild-eyed psycho. At this point, Buck jumps in, rips the man's rifle from his hands, and as they struggle, pushes him through a window into the burning home, which promptly and conveniently collapses on him. Buck is able to do his one last act of kindness. He keeps John company while he slowly drifts off to his eternal slumber. Buck returns to the cabin every so often, remembering John and his time with him. But having heard the all-too-alluring call of the wild like a lonely sailor hearing the song of a beautiful siren, he leaves mankind forever at this point. He becomes the leader of the wolf pack and has pups of his own. Answering the call of the wild is where this lovable and loyal canine that was too wild for civilization finally found peace and purpose. You could call it a bittersweet ending. I would recommend this for anyone interested in one or more of the following things: an endearing and touching story with good morals infused into it, animal lovers, or those interested in tales mostly centered around a lovable dog, those of you who are interested in the gold rush era and what things were like in those days, and of course, anyone who appreciates the great outdoors and, dare I say, feels the call of the wild. It's a good old-fashioned, kid-friendly movie that the whole family can enjoy. As I mentioned before, to me, it's simply what I would call a pleasant movie, and I enjoyed the morals the story tries to give. With regard to those items, I'd give it 7.75 out of 10. This gets the Matthew Brewski seal of pleasant. Seeing a movie like this is good to take you away from the daily grind, especially if you live in the city and aren't able to see the refreshing and calming beauty of the great outdoors in person very often. This is the Apocalyst review of Call of the Wild. Thanks for watching.